What makes a wise man? Not what makes a man wise, but what makes a wise man? Is it just wisdom that causes one to be a wise man, or is there more to it? I think all of us probably strive for wisdom, and if we don't think that we need wisdom, no pun intended, but that's not a very wise thing at all. Is it just wisdom? Or is there more that is involved in being a wise person? Our text today comes from James 3:13 through 14, if you'd like to turn there. James 3:13 through 14 is our text. And in James 3:13 and 14, James continues this talk about the tongue, but it's almost as if he seems to change places, or change topics rather, in what he's talking about. And if you were to just casually read verses 12 and then 13, it would almost seem very abrupt. In James 3:13 through 14, he says, "Who is a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? Let him show out of a good conversation, that is, a good life, his works with meekness of wisdom. But if ye have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not and lie not against truth." James says if a man is wise, then he needs to show that he is wise. He needs to prove it. So let me ask again, what makes a wise man? We have 3 points today. What example does a wise man leave? Number one, what example does a wise man leave? And the points 2 and 3 are, if he leaves a bad example, then how does he combat it? Point number 2, if he leaves a bad example. Point number 3, then how does he combat it? Number 1, what example does a wise man leave? In James 3 and verse 13, who is a wise man and endued with knowledge from among you? Why would James flip topics so abruptly like that? It almost seems as though in the first part of this chapter he says, brethren, you need to control your tongue. You need to make sure that you have God on your side to control your tongue, because no man can control it. It's an unruly evil. It's full of deadly poison. And by the way, who is a wise man among you? It's almost as if that's almost what it seems like. What James is really doing is he's readdressing the audience of the chapter. I'm not talking about Jewish Christians here, although that is the main audience. Look back at verse 1 in James chapter 3. In verse 1, he says, "My brethren, be not many masters," that is, teachers, "knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation, the stricter judgment." Teaching the gospel is such an important thing, and they are to use, teachers that is, are to use their words for the glory of God, use them wisely. And James begins by talking about that responsibility and work, but then he expands that to include all people. He talks about in many things we stumble, and he talks about stumbling in the use of the tongue and the evil uses of the tongue, and then he brings it back to teachers. Who is a wise man endued with knowledge among you? He says if you're so wise and you're so understanding, that word means skilled, wise and skilled, then show it out of the good conduct of your life with meekness of wisdom. And in this section that we're talking about, he discusses the actions and the attitudes of teachers that can spoil their words, make them not good. That is, actions and attitudes that can spoil words of teachers. Who is a wise man? One qualification any and every teacher needs is wisdom. It's a qualification for leaders as well. In fact, God specified this. In Deuteronomy 1 and verse 13, he said, "Take you wise men and understanding, and known among your tribes, and I will make them rulers over you." Leaders are to have this. Teachers of the gospel are to have this. And I suppose if you're a teacher of the gospel, you, in some small way, become a leader yourself. But this is something that all of us ought to strive to have. But really, this especially applies to teachers, doesn't it? Wisdom, the need for wisdom, the attitudes that cause wisdom. Obtaining wisdom is important. It takes effort, and wisdom from above is not something that we just get over time. There is a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is facts and information. It's learning. Wisdom is applying that knowledge. This wisdom from above that James continues on in our chapter in verses 17 and 18, he has already begun talking about this back in chapter 1, verses 5 through 7. Go ahead and turn to James 1, 5 through 7 real briefly. He says in James 1, verses 5 through 7, if any of you lack wisdom, there's our word again, let him ask of God that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, nothing doubting. For he that doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. For let not that man think he shall receive anything of the Lord. Wisdom from above comes from praying for wisdom. It comes from asking for it from God and trusting that he will give it unto us, is what James tells us. When it comes to wisdom in general, I know people that have one but not the other. You know what I mean? Some people have wisdom and they don't have knowledge. And some people have knowledge but they don't have wisdom. I've got a family member. I could be wrong. I don't even think he has a 5th grade education. He does not know how to read. But he's one of the wisest men in our family. He knows how to make good decisions. He knows when a good deal is, when a bad deal is, when to get away from a situation. He is hardworking. He knows what to do. And I also know people who are full of book smarts and knowledge, but they ain't got a lick of sense. They have no idea what they're talking about half the time. And wisdom, it does usually come by experience, but wisdom from above comes from the Father. Who is a wise man and skilled among you? Let him show out of a good life, good works, his works of meekness, of wisdom. I think that we all probably know people who have arrived. You know what I mean by that? People who think they know just how life works and they're not afraid to share it. People who think that they're wise and endued with knowledge. We've all met people like this. I don't have to give you an example of what that looks like. But James says to all teachers, you think you're so wise. Do you think that you have this wisdom and this skill with which to teach the gospel? Show it. Prove it through good conduct of your life, in meekness of wisdom. We don't have wisdom by arguing that we do or claiming that we do. We've got to prove it. And it's not about what we say, but rather what we do. Now, that's how Christianity in general is, isn't it? It's not just about what we say, but it's also about what we do. Brethren, is Christianity something that we claim, or is it something that we prove? It's what we prove. Do we show our meekness, or are we proud and arrogant? Proverbs 11:2 says, when pride cometh, then cometh shame, but with the lowly is wisdom. Do we show Christ to the world? Do we evangelize to our neighbors, or do we just play Christian? If we practice Christianity, then we have wisdom that is from above. Whether or not we realize it, anyone that is prideful is given a slap in the face by this verse from James. Because he basically says, if you're not meek, then you're not wise. If you don't show your wisdom through meekness, you've got no wisdom to show in the first place. And a wise man proves he has wisdom by showing it in his attitudes and in his life. Just like how a Christian proves he is a Christian by his attitudes and by his life, the way he conducts himself. Only the meek can obtain the blessings of the gospel, meek and wise. In Matthew 11:28-30, Jesus said, come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you will find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Only the meek will follow after the example of Christ. In 1 Peter 2:21, for even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that ye should follow in his steps. When we ask the question, what example does a wise man leave? He leaves a good example. So what kind of example are we leaving? If we leave a bad example, this is our second point. Verse 14, if you have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not and lie not against the truth. He says if you have bitter envying and strife And unfortunately, the case is that James's brethren did suffer with that, or struggle with that back in their day. And James's brethren today often struggle with that too, with bitter envying and strife. He's a big fan of if-then statements. I don't know if you've noticed that in your studies of James. If you have bitter jealousy, envying, faction, or strife in your hearts, then do not rejoice over one another, do not lie against the truth. That is basically what he is saying here. That word bitter envying or jealousy, like we talked about in class this morning, the word jealousy is where we get the word zealous as well, in the Greek at least. To be zealous can be good and it can be bad. To be zealous, like we think of it, is a desire to be like someone who has done good. I think about Paul in Acts 22 and verse 3. He talks about his qualifications. He says he was born a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers. And I was zealous towards God as ye all are this day. That's how Paul was. He decided to be like Christ. I want to be like Christ. I want to be zealous towards him and follow after what he says. In 1 Corinthians 11:1, Paul encourages, be ye followers of me, even as I am of Christ. When we study good men of the Bible, like David, like Jonathan, like Peter and Paul, we might want to be like them, have their good characteristics, their qualities that were good. That is zealousness, wanting to be more like God. But to be jealous, which is what James is talking about here, that's the desire to have what somebody else has, to be like someone who has more than you. I think about Ahab, King Ahab, in 1 Kings 21, verses 1 through 4. He had a neighbor named Naboth. We're not going to read the whole passage, but it talks about how he went to Naboth. He says, I want that vineyard, name your price, which is actually a good thing. He went about it in a good way at first. But when he didn't get his way, he whined and he cried and he pouted to his wife Jezebel until she got rid of Naboth to give him that land. He was jealous. Now we might say it's the same word in the Greek, so how did they tell it apart? By the attitude that was applied to it. Just a little bit of context. The difference between jealousness and zealousness in this verse is, does it lead to bitterness? If I want to live up to God's standards and live a godly life, I'm not jealous of God. I'm not bitter. I'm zealous. But if I want what my neighbor has and I begin to treat him differently and I begin to think, I deserve what he has, I work just as hard as he does, and I begin to think, I don't like that man very much, I become bitter. I become jealous of what he has. That word bitter, if you're like me, you think of the flavor of bitter. And I was thinking about, this is embarrassing, but I was thinking about a time when I was younger, and I was getting ready for church one Sunday, and I didn't feel very good, and I didn't want to deal with that during worship, nauseousness and things like that. And I had heard that the wonderful concoction called apple cider vinegar is supposed to cure nauseousness. Now, spoiler alert for the end of the story, it does cure nauseousness in one way or another. But I took a little medicine bottle, I poured some in, and my dad knew I was about to drink it. He stood at the doorway just waiting for me to put that in my mouth, apple cider vinegar. And as soon as it hit my tongue, brethren, I'm not kidding, I think my jaw was paralyzed for about 5 minutes by how bitter and sour that stuff is. Don't ever drink it. Never drink that, brethren. It was disgusting. It was bitter. Bitterness in our hearts leaves a taste behind. Not a physical taste. But that taste, that bitterness, it causes jealousy and it causes envy to grow within us. In Hebrews 12, 14, and 15, we find one of the things that it causes us to do. Hebrews 12, 14, and 15, the Hebrews writer wrote, "Follow peace with all men, and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord, looking diligently, lest any man should fail of the grace of the Lord, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. Now, there's a lot to cover in those verses, but the point I want to draw from it is, when we are bitter towards people, we lose our opportunity to have peace with them. And we lose our peace with many people when we are bitter people. It drives away the peace that we have. And part of the reason that this is because of the next thing that James says. He says, but if ye have bitter envying, that is jealousy, and strife. Some versions say faction in your hearts. That refers to factiousness, a state of mind when selfishness motivates us, being out of harmony with people because we want what they have. There's jealousy, which is inward. It's bitterness. But there's also factiousness or faction or strife, which is an outward jealousy as well. It pushes us to further sinful attitudes, to refuse to be at peace with our brethren. Jealousy, and that is envying, is the outward jealousy. And strife or factiousness is inward jealousy. And it pushes us to do more sinful attitude, or have more sinful attitudes. If you would, just turn for a moment to Galatians 5. Galatians 5, verses 19 through 21. You might be familiar with Galatians 5, 22 and 23, that talks about the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, long-suffering, those things. But before the fruit of the Spirit, Paul mentions the works of the flesh that are manifest in some. And he lists off many of them. In Galatians 5, 19 through 21, he says the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these, and he lists many of them. He says adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions and heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings, and such like, of the which I tell you before, note this, as I have also told you in times past, that they which do such things will not enter into the kingdom of God. These kinds of people cannot, shall not, will not inherit heaven as long as they have bitterness in their hearts. He ends the verse by saying, glory not, that is, rejoice not, and lie not against the truth. The word for glory means to exult, rejoice over someone, specifically because of some perceived advantage. If I rejoiced over you, for example, being a preacher, that would be like me saying, I'm better than you because I'm a preacher. Now, I hope you understand I don't have that attitude, and I hope I have proved that through my actions. But if I were to have that glorying, just like James talks about, that would be me rejoicing because I'm somehow superior. And the grammar of that word in the Greek refers to it being to the hurt of others. Others are being hurt by it. Perhaps if I were to do that, I would become a stumbling block. I would make it harder for people to be a Christian around me. Can you imagine what it would be like if I were a person of bitterness, if I were a person that rejoiced because I was somehow greater than you, and you had to worship every Sunday, hearing me speak, things like that? That would be very difficult, I think, as a Christian. That would drive a rift between us. But not only were the brethren glorying, they were lying against the truth. Specifically, rather literally, they were false to the truth. They violated it because of their envy, because of their pride and extolling themselves. In Proverbs 6, 17 through 19, in listing the 7 things that God hates, it says, and this is the one that the Proverbs writer tops the list off with, he that soweth discord among brethren. One of the things that God hates is when his children act with a divisive attitude, in dividing each other, in hurting him and the church. One man put it like this, and I think this puts it in a very severe way. He said, it would be better to be the Roman soldier who stabbed the physical body of Jesus with a spear than to be one who drives a sword in his spiritual body, dividing the brethren. I thought that was interesting. Okay, so we have these attitudes we don't want to practice and we don't want to have in our lives. So how do we combat it? Let's tie this all together in our third point. How do we combat it? Our words show what kind of person we are. Our words can form the character that others think of us as. And one way to combat such attitudes that spoil our words and our actions is through love. We think, Canon, what's love got to do with it? Well, love has a lot to do with it. In 1 Corinthians 13:1, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not love, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. That is meaningless noise if I don't have love in my life. Love for my brethren, and love for others as well. He continues on in 1 Corinthians 13:4-7, love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant. It does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own. It is not provoked. It does not take into account a wrong suffered. Love does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Paul says that love does not have jealousy. Love is not arrogant. It doesn't rejoice over the truth. It doesn't rejoice over other people. It rejoices with the truth, in the truth. We ought to have love for one another, a kind of love that no man can afford with money, the love that puts value on the soul. This is kind of a side note, but in my studies with people here in Lepanto and in getting to know others, I think I've found the one thing that, at least here, is hardest, that people say, hardest to practice. I've seen this in townsfolk that I've studied with. They've said the hardest thing for me to do is to love one another and not be angry with people. You know, when they're mean to you or when they're spiteful and they hurt you. They say, that's the hardest thing for me to do, Canon. I can understand that being difficult. Let me encourage all of us, myself included, with something along those lines. It may be hard to love prideful, arrogant, bitter, jealous people, but it becomes easier when we think of them as the precious souls that Jesus sees us as, the kind of people that he came and died for on the cross. Let us have love. And let us also have consideration. Take time to think on our lives and who we are and where we came from. In 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 12, let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. If we think that we're someone special, that we deserve what someone else has, then we don't have a place to stand at all. I think about, I know this is strange, but Genesis 3 and verse 19. You remember how God created man? He said, from the dust of the earth, from dust you came, to dust you shall return. When I think I'm someone special, I just need to remind myself where I came from and what my body is going to be gone back to when I die. I came from the dust of the earth. I'd rather have no reason to be arrogant or prideful when I remember where I came from. And anything that I've accumulated in my life, when I die, I can't take it with me to heaven. It's just stuck here on earth until it rots away. And finally, by changing our thoughts, and we change our hearts, which changes our words. I'll say that again. When we change our thoughts, we will change our hearts, which changes our words and our attitudes as well. In Matthew 15:11, not that which goeth into the mouth defileth the man, but that which cometh out of the mouth, this defileth a man. So I ask, what are we putting into our hearts? What are we putting into our thoughts? In Luke 6 and verse 45, a good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things. An evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil things. For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. By changing what we put into our minds and allowing into our hearts, we can change who we are as people. In Philippians 4:8, it says, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, honest, just, pure, lovely, of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be anything praiseworthy, think on these things. And that's what we replace our thoughts with. Let me ask one more time, what makes a wise man? If he claims to be wise, if he claims to be pure in life, he has to make sure that claim is accurate, working good works with meekness of wisdom. He can't have the attitudes of pride or jealousness or factiousness. And if he's any of those things, he has to combat those attitudes by love, by consideration, and by changing his thinking. Sometimes we need to change our thinking. When we're tempted to do wrong, we might give in. We might struggle with the sins that we deal with, and we might give in again and again. And if we struggle like that, it's time that we change our thinking. More than just, oh man, that was a bad thing that I did. Lord, forgive me, I'm sorry. But more than that, true repentance, a change of heart that leads to a change of life. Maybe you're here today and you struggle with the sins of your life. We want to help you. We'll pray with you. We'll pray for you. We want to help each other become wise men and women, brothers and sisters in Christ who lead godly lives. And if we can help you in any way, come forward now as we stand and as we sing.